Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Harvard Kennedy School professor Joseph Nye knows no more introduction. His soft power theory has helped Taiwan build a global brand of democracy, human rights, tolerance, and progressive values, such as gender equality and LGBTQ rights. As the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage, and ranked as OECD's #1 in Asia for gender equality, Taiwan's 23 million people have proven to the world that its appeal lies in its smart, soft power, despite its precarious place in geopolitics. At the same time, Taiwan's technological prowess, especially its leadership in semiconductors, is becoming its shield. Today, we'd like Professor Nye to give us a big picture analysis of the changing global power dynamics and their implications for Taiwan-US-China relations. Welcome, Professor Nye.
Nice to be with you, Wenqi.
You wrote in the 1990s that the rapid rise of China could cause a global conflict, the Thucydides scenario. But you also cautioned that the belief in the inevitability of conflict can become one of its main causes. You wrote, there's a possible scenario in which each side, believing it will end up at war with each other, makes reasonable military preparations in accordance with that assumption, which then are read by the other side as confirmation of its worst fears. Does that apply to today's Taiwan Strait?
Yes, it does. I mean, one of the great ironies of human behavior is that the belief that something is inevitable can itself become a cause of that thing. So if one believes, for example, that a war in the Taiwan Strait between China and the U.S. is inevitable, then both sides will push the limits to have the advantage of the first mover. So I think it's important to be realistic and say, no, war is not inevitable. Doesn't mean we can't blunder into a war, but the belief of inevitability can itself become a cause.
So it sounds like the deterrence strategy currently deployed by the U.S. and allies and Taiwan, would you say the buildup of military preparations in some way is leading us in that direction of thinking?
I don't think so, because I believe the buildup of military preparations is essentially based on the need to deter Beijing from using force. The way to think about the policy is to see it as no use of force by Beijing and no declaration of de jure independence by Taipei. And that requires what you might call double deterrence, the ability to deter Taipei from declaring formal independence, and the ability to deter Beijing from thinking it can use force. What's interesting is that approach, which is a compromise that was reached between Kissinger and Mao back in 1972, has lasted all these years. And I think our efforts in policy are to make it last.
I think what you were referring to is also framed as strategic ambiguity or double deterrence. Well, yes, it has worked for decades, but is now in question almost by many people in Washington, D.C. And even President Biden has said 4 times that the U.S. Will intervene if China invades Taiwan. And what is your view on this?
Well, notice that every time Biden has spoken, the White House has issued a declaration that our policy hasn't changed. And the way to understand that is, as you said, double deterrence. What's important to notice is that if Biden gives Taiwan a ironclad guarantee, then there'd be more there may be more actions which would provoke Beijing into taking risks. So one way to think about it is you want to build up your military capability both on Taiwan and in the US to deter Beijing from using force. But you don't want to poke your finger in Beijing's eye, which would be what a formal declaration of independence would be. So in that sense, I think the policy is still relevant. And Biden's statements may be useful just to remind Beijing that there is a significant probability that the U.S. would become involved.
Well, obviously, it's a very hard balance to strike related to whether the U.S. should be involved or will be involved in the Taiwan Strait conflict is the role of the U.S. in the world. What's happening in Ukraine and the subsequent U.S. response together with its allies offer a possible answer to a scenario of a potential conflict over Taiwan Strait. However, there's a growing fraction of America that wants the U.S. to retrench from global affairs. How does the U.S. maintain a liberal world order when the calling for isolationism continues to grow?
Well, it is a problem. But notice that there's always been an isolationist group in American foreign policy. The Chicago Council on World Affairs International Affairs does a survey every other year that goes all the way back to 1972. And what they found is there are about 30% of the American people who don't want to be involved with the rest of the world. That's a lot less than the 1930s, when the large majority of the U.S. people were isolationist, but that isolationist core is still there. Right now, it's becoming powerful in part of the Republican Party because of the narrowness of the Republican majority in the House of Representatives, which means that a few right-wing votes can essentially determine the position of the majority leader, the Speaker of the House. And so there is some danger of cutting back on aid to Ukraine, but by and large, American public opinion still supports aid to Ukraine.
Well, in the case of Taiwan, do you think that would be different?
No, I think trying to understand a Taiwan conflict scenario is very dependent upon what happens. If, for example, Taiwan declared independence, which I don't expect, but if it did and Beijing said that's crossed our red line, then there's some uncertainty of how strongly the Americans would react in terms of defense of Taiwan. If, on the other hand, Beijing were to act in an unprovoked way to try to invade Taiwan, my own personal guess is the United States would come to Taiwan's assistance. So speculating about the outcome of such a conflict depends on these other conditions.
Yeah, but one Republican presidential candidate has also said that if he were elected the president, he would secure Taiwan until the U.S. is completely independent in terms of semiconductor manufacturing capability. What is your view on that? It seems to look at Taiwan, or only wants to be involved in a very utilitarian kind of manner.
Well, notice the Republican who has said this, Ramaswamy, was widely criticized in the first Republican debate for being very ignorant of international affairs and not having a serious foreign policy. So I don't think we should take his views all that seriously. But even more, suppose that he were elected, which is improbable, and suppose he tried to implement that policy. There's no way that by 2027 the U.S. is not going to be heavily or remain heavily interdependent with Taiwan in the area of semiconductors. So he's not only wrong-headed, he can't do it.
Well, I think you rewrote an article recently whether the U.S. is retreating to isolationism, and of course, your answer response previously kind of alluded that the U.S. is not going to entirely right now. And just last week, the United Nations Annual Assembly took place in New York. Probably for the first time, only one of the 5 permanent National Security Council members, the United States, sent its leader, Biden. The other 4, Russia, China, France, and the UK, are all absent. What does this say about this global institution? And even if the US is not retrenching from global affairs, what about the other powers?
Well, I don't think we should read too much into one year's General Assembly attendance in terms of support for the UN. The UN has lots of problems, but as they say, if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. It's still the one forum where you have all nations being able to make their case. The fact that some nations in the permanent 5 did not come at the level of head of state, I don't think means that the UN has lost all its value. And it is interesting, going back to your earlier point about US and isolationism, that Biden felt it worth his while to spend time at the UN.
Well, that's probably good news for some of the people who do believe that global institutions still play a role. And in fact, Taiwan is a firm believer that one day many people would like to see Taiwan as a UN member again. You famously coined the term soft power to describe a nation's ability to persuade and attract that is derived from its culture, political ideals, and policies. But it seems that most powers, including China, US, Russia, are projecting less of their soft power today. Do you agree, or what is your interpretation?
Well, Russia never had very much soft power.
What about China?
China has been trying to develop and project its soft power ever since 2007, when Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress that China needed to develop soft power. But what's interesting is and China spent billions of dollars trying to develop its soft power, which is, as you said, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. What's interesting, if you look at the Pew polls, which are good international polls, China does not have as much attractiveness as the United States in any continent except Africa, where the US and China are roughly tied. So China has made efforts through the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as Confucius Institutes and other things, to increase its soft power, but it hasn't got a very good return on its money.
And why do you think that's the case? Do they just not know how to do that?
Well, they have. I have been asked that by Chinese officials, and I say, well, you have 2 major problems. One is you have territorial disputes with your neighbors. It's very hard to develop soft power by setting up a Confucius Institute in New Delhi if your troops are killing Indian soldiers on the border in the Himalayas.
Indeed.
And China has half a dozen disputes with neighbors, and that explains some of China's lack of soft power in Asia. But in addition, in areas like Western Europe or the US or Australia, in the democratic countries, Chinese insistence on tight party control over civil society makes them less attractive. I mean, the great irony is China develops or produces a brilliant artist like Ai Weiwei, and then either chucks him in jail or exiles him. That's not a very good formula for developing soft power. So if China really is serious about becoming a major contender in the soft power stakes, it's not enough just to set up Confucius Institutes or provide assistance through the BRI. They have to make these major changes at home. And I don't expect or don't believe they're capable of it.
Well, that is my next question. In the case of China, when it comes to Taiwan, it just seems incapable is probably the right word, of being charming and attractive in order to bring Taiwan closer. It just keeps pushing Taiwan further away by using coercion and threats. It is indeed something that puzzles many observers. I guess what is your interpretation? Do you think soft power is a more Western concept, or there's something else more?
No, China certainly aspires to soft power, and one can go back to the great classics of Chinese culture, like Lao Tzu, and see that he talked a lot about. He didn't call it soft power. He talked about the importance of attracting rather than coercing. I think the problem is that in domestic politics within China today, any effort to use soft power would be regarded as, in quotes, being weak on the dangers of Taiwan declaring formal independence. And so essentially, you're correct that China would get a lot further with a policy of honey rather than vinegar in attracting Taiwan. But the domestic politics inside China mean they're stuck with a vinegar policy, and it's counterproductive. On the other hand, Taiwan benefits from its soft power in the sense that the success of Taiwan as a democracy is one of Taiwan's great assets. And I think that is important for Taiwan to remember. I remember meeting with President Ma Ying-jeou at one point and explaining this to him. It's a little bit like Ukraine and soft power. You could say, well, there's a war going on, and the future of the war will be determined by hard power of military coercion. But notice that the soft power of Ukraine, which was the attractiveness of protecting a democracy threatened by an authoritarian neighbor, meant that Zelensky was able to transfer Ukraine's soft power into hard power, which is the delivery of weapons from the US and from Western Europe. So Taiwan needs to continue to pay attention to its soft power.
Well, good advice. What is your prediction for the next 18 months of Taiwan-US-China relations? And do you think the presidential elections, both in Taiwan and the US next year, will have further implications for the world?
Well, I suspect that what we'll see is a continuation of the status quo for the next 18 to 24 months. And I don't think the election in Taiwan or in the US is going to change that. But you never know. I mean, if a candidate in Taiwan thinks that he or she would get more votes, and by promising de jure independence, that could upset the apple cart. If an American candidate for president were to say, well, I will send delegations to Taiwan at such a high level that it's the equivalent of de jure independence, that could upset the apple cart. I think both sides realize that either of those strategies would be a foolish strategy, whereas the earlier strategy I mentioned of preserving the status quo is a much more sensible strategy.
Yeah, I think the question is, what does status quo mean, and what is, declaring independence? What does that really mean? It seems that Beijing has changed its attitudes and positions from time to time, depending on who is the political leader in Taiwan. And so while these terms make a lot of sense, what is actually happening and what actions are actually taken by different sides seem to be interpreted differently. So it's going to be a very complicated and unpredictable few months, I would say, for the next year or so. But thank you so much for dissecting global politics for our audience today. And we definitely hope to have you back, perhaps after next year's presidential election in Taiwan, so you can enlighten us again about what's going to happen between Taiwan, US, and China. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed the interview, and good luck to all.
Thank you.